Welcome. This is a Flame Ministry, and I am your host, Pastor Kathleen Panning. This is a show about ministry, about the joys and the challenges of sharing God's love in the 21st century. And there's going to be a lot of different guests coming on over the course of this show. But for now, for today, it's me because I've got some things I want to share with you. I'd like to tell you a little bit about who I am and why this show is important to me, why I'm doing this in the first place. I've been a pastor for about 40 years now, and the tradition I grew up in was a wonderful tradition. I'm still a part of that tradition today and a pastor in that tradition. But when I was growing up and thinking about things that I wanted to do in life and, what the old question, what do you want to be when you grow up type of thing. Um, Very early on in the like seventh grade, perhaps, I started feeling like there was this nudging from God to do something within the life of the church. But as I looked around, all I could see for women were very traditional roles, and the things that were available for women just didn't seem to fit for me. Because when I grew up, you see, uh, men and boys were the ones who lit the candles at church. They were the ones who read the scripture. They were the ones who preached and did all of the things in front in the church. They were the ushers at the church. They carried the cross if that was something that was done. Women and girls were allowed to sing in the choir, to help in the nursery, to teach Sunday school, especially for the little kids, and to work in the kitchen. That's what women did. Oh, and men were the ones, very early on in my childhood, men were the only ones who voted as well on issues. And soon women got to be able to do that too. But men were the only ones who were on the governing board of the church. Women could serve on some committees, like maybe things to do with the education for the children, maybe things to do with, um, working in the kitchen and serving meals and those kinds of things as well. But as far as the leadership within the church, that was all done by men. As far as being anything up front in the church, that was all done by men. And so the things professionally that were available to women were what was called in that day the Lutheran. I'm Lutheran, so it was the Lutheran Deaconess Movement or diaconate, and that was for women who were single. It didn't have to take a vow of chastity, but you had to be single to be part of this, and to work in places like an orphanage or a nursing home, to work in mission fields, to teaching, basically, and as a nurse. Those were things that were open to women to be able to do officially in the church. Also to be uh, a like the secretary at a church, or parish worker. And that was somebody who basically was in charge of the education program and sometimes dealing with the teenage youth group within the church. And so those were the things that were available to women. And as I looked at that, none of those seemed to fit for me. That just they were fine. I didn't criticize any of them. I knew some women who were deaconesses, had great respect for them. In fact, had a great aunt who was a deaconess. I knew people who were involved in being parish workers and those kinds of things. I had great respect for everybody, all of the women who did those things, but it just didn't seem to fit for me. And it wasn't until I was starting college that it became possible for women to be pastors within my Lutheran tradition. And when I heard that, that was kind of like one of those light bulb moments that go, says, oh, that's where I'm supposed to be. That's what I'm supposed to do. And so that became the path that I traveled. And I have served in a variety of different ministry settings in a couple of small rural congregations where I was the pastor for two congregations. I have served in a very large congregation where I was one of five full-time pastors on the staff. I have served in a team ministry with my husband, with the two of us together. I've done some chaplaincy work. And so it's been a variety of things that I've done. And there's been wonderful, beautiful things from each and every one of those experiences. So that's a little bit about who I am. But along the way, I've also learned some things and realized that I grew up in this Lutheran tradition. I'm part of it. It's been a tradition I love and very much treasure and cherish. But I also begun to learn some things about other traditions, even other faiths. And over the last, especially last 20 years or so, I've gotten a broader perspective and been reaching out, and sometimes intentionally, sometimes it's been just something that beneficently has happened, to be in the company of people of some other faiths and some other traditions. And I've learned that there's a real joy in that. There's beauty in being with colleagues in the same tradition, yes, but there's also things I have learned from others. And actually, this all started many, many, many years ago. This kind of perspective that there's a beauty in diversity. And I want to tell you a story. It's a true story, and it has become for me kind of a living parable of how life is and some of the ways in which God intends things. When I was a child, my family lived in a small town, about 3,000 people, and it was, oh, about 25 miles or so from a larger city. Today, it's a suburb of that larger city. But when I was a child, there was open country in between, even a couple of farms in between where I lived and that city. And my grandparents happened to live in that nearby city. So about once a month or every 6 weeks or so, my family would go into the city to spend some time with grandma and grandpa. And that was always a wonderful thing. I had other cousins that also lived in the city, and there were times when we'd get together, especially around holidays like Thanksgiving and Christmas. Often we were gathered at grandma and grandpa's house for those kinds of things. But many other times during the year, we would go over there to visit too. And one of the things I really loved about going to grandma and grandpa's house was driving down that street. Because you see, to get to grandma and grandpa's, just before we got there, there was a wider street, a main thoroughfare. And then there were off of that, the residential streets. And every one of those residential streets had something in common. And it was the trees. The trees on the street, because you see, those streets were about wide enough for two cars to, one to pass the other. And if you had a car parked along the street, you couldn't park two cars on the same, right next to each other, because then you'd be blocking the whole street. So, if you had one car parked on one side of the street, everybody would kind of weave their way up and down the street to get around parked cars. But so that gives you an idea of the width of the street there. And on each side of the street, there was the curb, and then there was a grassy area, maybe 4 or 5 feet wide, and then a sidewalk, and then you'd start the lawn for the homes on that side of the street. And in that grassy area, that little kind of boulevard area, whatever you want to call it, in that grassy area, the city had planted trees. And those trees had been planted years and years ago, because even as a young child, they were full grown. Those were big trees. And one of the things that was so really wonderful about that, is the way those trees grew. Now, if you look at a lot of different kinds of trees, the branches on those trees have different ways of growing. Some trees, the branches grow out pretty horizontally, and then the bottom ones, and then the other branches kind of fill in, and it becomes almost like a dome over for the tree. Other trees have one branch going this way, another one going that way, and they all kinds of different directions. And but then these trees on my grandparents' street had a very unique way of growing. The trees, the branches grew up, but then they curved outward. And so they were tall enough and big enough so that those outward curving branches met over the street. And they formed this beautiful archway, which I later came to know and understand looked like the arch of a Gothic, the windows in a Gothic cathedral, kind of coming to a point, arched and coming to a point over the street there. And so every time we'd turn down the street to my grandparents' house, or I'd look down the side streets before my grandparents' house, it would be like looking into this green, arched, almost cathedral-like atmosphere to it. And it had just kind of a magical quality to it. And the leaves on those trees they weren't really big, and kind of spaced apart. So it wasn't a dense shade. It was kind of a dappled sunlight. And there was this kind of magical quality about driving down that street and the appearance on a sunny day, or the kind of hazy quality if there was fog or some other kind of daylight going on. And this was in a northern part of the country of the United States, which meant that those trees in the fall, the leaves turned color. So instead of green in the fall, there would be this yellow, bright yellow archway that we would be driving into a tunnel of beautiful yellow leaves. And then in winter, when the leaves had fallen and the trees were bare, even then, the shaping of the branches in this wonderful archway over this street still had a beauty to it. It was, oh, and then when there was one of those magical snowfalls, because snow does fall in that part of the country, when there was one of those magical snowfalls, it would be like God took this big tube of icing, of frosting, and just frosted every single branch and every single twig on those trees. And if you got there before the wind came, oh, it was just so beautiful. Such a gorgeous, gorgeous look with all of that snow frosting every single one of those branches. Didn't happen very often, but every once in a while got there to see that magical appearance of those beautiful, beautiful branches. That was the beauty of driving up to Grandma and Grandpa's house every single time we came to visit. I went off to college to not too far away, but far enough away that I lived on campus, and then went on to graduate school to seminary, even farther away. And it was, I think during graduate school, I came back home one time and we went to visit Grandma and Grandpa, and I was in the car with my parents. And as we came down the wider street before turning onto the residential street of where my grandparents lived, I started looking down some of those residential streets. And one of the first ones I noticed that some of the trees were missing. Not many, but a couple of trees were gone. And I mentioned it to my parents, and the explanation that they gave was that there was a disease that was in some of those trees, and the disease killed the trees, and it was carried by a beetle. The beetle would burrow in under the bark of those trees, and then the disease would get in into the heart of the tree, into the softer wood of the tree, and it would eventually kill the tree. Now, the thing is, because the branches of those trees touched over the road, they also touched on the same side of the road. So, in front of each house somewhere, there was one of these trees planted, and the branches on the same side of the road from tree to tree would touch. And that provided this wonderful highway, easy access for the beetles to go from one tree to the next on the same side of the street and to the opposite side of the street. And then people would drive down the street and maybe a beetle would land on a car and they would go to another street and park there someplace, and the beetles would crawl off and onto the ground and eventually crawl up another tree on another street. And so there were some trees that were missing on the first couple of streets I looked down. And I was just really hoping that the beetles weren't getting to the street where my grandparents lived and that the city was finding a way to get rid of those beetles so that they wouldn't infect the trees on my grandparents' street. And apparently this city was trying all kinds of different things. They were using pesticides. They were using some sorts of fertilizers to help strengthen trees and everything, but so far things weren't working so well. Well, my grandparents' street was still fine, and I was relieved because that beautiful archway of trees was still there. It was many months, 6 months, maybe even a year later, when I was home again and we went to visit Grandma and Grandpa. And again, I was in the car with my parents. And as we approached where they lived, I started looking down the side streets again to find out what was happening with those trees. And the first street, there wasn't a single tree left on that street. All of the trees were gone. The next street, the same thing. All of the trees were gone. And the next one. And I was holding my breath, just hoping and praying that maybe the city had cut down all of those trees to get rid of the beetles before it got to my grandparents' street. And we turned down their street. Every single tree was gone. In fact, my parents said that the city cut down all of those kinds of trees throughout the whole city, and that was what was needed in order to stop those beetles, to get rid of the disease. It looked so barren, so empty, driving down that street where my grandparents lived. It was almost like being in the wrong place. It was kind of foreign. The city eventually replanted trees, yes, but they weren't the same kind of trees all up and down the street. In fact, there were at least 2 varieties of trees on each block and each street, and they weren't the same variety next to each other on the same side of the street, and they weren't the same variety across the street from each other. And they weren't going to be trees probably that would ever have those wonderfully arched branches that would touch over the street ever again. That experience has taught me that there's a beauty, there's a wondrous beauty and joy in things that are the same, in being together with people like us, not only seeing trees and massive plantings of flowers that are all the same, or all the same kinds of tree in an area. That's beautiful. It's got its own kind of beauty and wonder and joy to it. And there's no denying that. And I love being with people who are in my own faith group, and we share a lot of things together, and I truly enjoy that. But there's also a vulnerability in that. There is even a weakness, you might say, in that. My studio here has a window in front of me, and I can look out and see trees, naturally growing trees, not like planted in a park or anything like that. These are all trees that have grown up naturally. And as I look out there, I see a variety of oak trees, a couple of kinds of elm trees, some cedar trees, some pine trees, and a bunch of other kinds of trees as well. I don't even really know all of the names of them. And there's beauty in that as well. I have learned that some of those kinds of trees have a taproot, and that root tends to go, that the tap part of it, the real main part of that root tends to go as far down into the soil as the tree goes high. That means it can go 20, 30, 40, maybe even 50 feet down. And yes, there are other roots that go out, but it's that amazing tap root that is the strength of that kind of tree. But there are other trees that have roots that aren't as deep, but they spread out. Some of them spread out as far as the crown of the tree, the diameter of the crown. Some of them spread out even much further than that. And those trees, with their root system spreading out, help hold the soil in place. They provide a mat of all kinds of different benefits to the soil, and to help support other trees that are around them. Some of the ones with the taproot as well, and some of the ones with shallower roots and a denser ball of roots that aren't as wide. And some of those other tree roots help to support those trees. And some of the trees have nuts that they produce. Some of them have seeds. Some of them have berries. And those trees feed a variety of wildlife. And without having that variety of trees, some of that wildlife could not be, or would have to go somewhere else to find food and sustenance. Not only things like deer and squirrels and those kinds of wildlife, but also a variety of birds. And watching the birds is something I also enjoy. So it's wonderful to have that variety. And the variety there is also helps prevent disease. If a disease got into one species of oak tree, that would be significant, and it would have an effect on that wooded area, but it wouldn't wipe it out. There would be many, many other trees that could be supportive of it. And in fact, there was a disease not long, about 15, 19 or so years ago, in fact, that there was a disease in some of the pine trees in this area. And some of the pine trees had to be cut down because of that. But there's so many other trees there around in the woods in this area that even when those pine trees were cut, it didn't destroy the whole woodland. It didn't wipe everything out. So the variety has a God-given purpose. It has a beauty, it has a wonder to it. And that has informed me about the beauty and the wonder of the variety of us as people, of the beauty and the wonder of the variety of different beliefs and different faith groups, and being able to learn from each other, to appreciate the differences. Doesn't mean I have to agree with everybody. Doesn't mean I have to follow some of the same practices. But it means that there is wonder in that. And that variety says something about God's love. God's love is for everybody. In fact, the very first guest I had on this show, for the first two shows, in fact, is the author, Dr. Jacqueline Bussey, author of the book, Love Without Limits. Her personal journey of learning about God's love having absolutely no limits, even to people that at one point she wasn't sure were people God could love. And to me, that's like saying we need each other. God has created every single one of us, just like God creates every single kind of tree, every single kind of animal, every single kind of flower, everything that there is in this planet. That's a part of God's creation. And God has created you, and God has created me. And that means every gift that we have, every personality characteristic, every way of looking at the world, every belief system that's there has something that we can benefit from, some gift to bring, something that can nourish and support and sustain all of us in a variety of different ways. And so this show is going to be about sharing those kinds of things, talking with people who have different perspectives, talking with people who work with other kinds of ministry and how to love some of the people who might be challenging to love at times, helping people who might be challenging to help at times, and working in many of those different ways. Um, I have a radio show that's also called A Flame Ministry, and I would encourage anybody to go listen to that as well. It's on Bold Brave Media or the BBM Global Network, and you can find it by putting in my name or the name of Flame Ministry. And I've interviewed a prison chaplain talking about ministry with inmates and what he is learning about the beauty and the joy of what these inmates can bring and their stories, and that they are too also human beings. Some of them very broken, some of them have done some very bad things, but they are human beings, and that they are loved by God. And God's love is there for them too, in spite of some of the things that they have done. And God's love is there for every single person who's watching this, every single person on this planet. Not always because of what we do. Sometimes it's because of, in spite of what we do, not because of it, but in spite of what we do. And that's true for every single one of us. I'm not perfect, and I don't claim to be, and none of us is. So God's love is there for every one of us. And so we're here to work on sharing the joys and the challenges sometimes of sharing God's love in the 21st century with new ways of technology like this TV show, new kinds of issues like social media and how do we use that? What's proper, what's not proper? How can we utilize that in faithful ways for sharing God's love? How can we use the internet for sharing God's love? How can we reconnect people instead of being at a distance through social media? So there's many, many different challenges that we face. How can we bridge the divides and the divisions that are in our culture today? So that's part of what's going on with this show too. So many things to come. That there's going to be a lot coming up in the new year and in future shows. So I really encourage you to please continue to watch and be a part of this show. This is a flame ministry, and it's about the sharing of the flame of God's love with everyone. And so come back and join us again for another show. And each week, I'm going to challenge you every single week to find, not just every week, every single day, find 3 things, at least 3 things for which you are grateful. And even keep a journal of that. I encourage you to do that every single day. 3 things that you're grateful for, and at least one way that you can share God's love with someone else. Might be in a text message, it might be in an email, it might be in person, but one way that you can share God's love with someone else. So until next time, this is A Flame Ministry. I'm Kathleen Panning, and I look forward to seeing you again next show. God's blessings.